on Facebook. And this meeting is being recorded so that we can share it afterwards to anyone who was unable to make the event. We're also live streaming this on Facebook, where you can watch this. And if you want to post anything on social media, please do so. And our handle is at Freedom United HQ across all the platforms. So just a little bit about what's out there and the topic of consumption and modern slavery, and why we've chosen right now. We've chosen to do this event now because of Black Friday, which is a day that's well known in the US as a day for good shopping and sales. And how that came about, it actually has a fairly long recent history from the 1950s, when chaos that followed the day after Thanksgiving, when lots of shoppers flooded to the city in advance of a big football game. It was a time when the police had to work long shifts dealing with the crowds for the football match, and shoplifters actually took advantage of the chaos in shops. They took advantage of the chaos and the amount of work that the police had to do to make off with merchandise. By the 1980s, many of the shops were selling, turned this day and this event into a time to sell at big profit. And this really helped to solidify the idea of Black Friday, its reputation for deals across the United States. It's become really a one-day sales bonanza that's now often across 4 days, and is also spread to other countries. And maybe it's something you're familiar with where you live, if you're outside the US. There's also now a Cyber Monday, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving, when we also now we see lots of deals are being promoted. So since the late 21st century, with the advent of cheap travel, we're also seeing supply chains spreading further and further across the world, and companies buying and producing goods from more diverse places in the pursuit of reducing costs. And that cost is often labor. And that makes the journey that the goods that we buy that journey that it takes often it's quite long, quite fractured, not very visible to us as consumers, and opaque. So in that, we question exactly what is happening in those supply chains. What is the risk of modern slavery with lots of subcontractors? What kind of guarantees can any retailer provide us as to the conditions of workers in that supply chain? And we know that modern slavery is possible and present in many steps of the supply chain, from harvesting to manufacturing and shipping. So I think this really gives me a good segue to introduce our first speaker. He's Nick Hammer. Nick is a professor in work and employment in the University of Leicester's School of Business, and also co-director of the Centre for Sustainable Work and Employment Studies. Nick's research focuses on work and employment in global value chains, so exactly what I was talking about. And he's led a key research project on supply chain relations and working conditions in the UK garment manufacturing, and also regularly engages with government bodies as well as national and international media on fashion value chains. So his current research examines the enforcement of minimum labour standards in the apparel value chain. So my question is, Nick, I've given a bit of a basic introduction to supply chains, but you're an expert on this matter. Can you give us a breakdown of how modern supply chains work in a bit more detail, and give us an idea of like what happens to our money when we buy a good, so that we can have a bit of an understanding of why it is that actually international supply chains, rather than actually benefiting those living in global South countries that are producing these goods, are actually perhaps maybe not not actually doing that in practice? I'd love to hear a bit more from you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. I think what's interesting about the apparel industry, also historically, is that it's always been at the forefront of these global production networks, and essentially, it's useful to think about it in two different dimensions. There's a vertical one, which concerns the subcontracting of different stages of the production process. So obviously, we would think that cotton growing, fabric manufacture are separate processes, but that even extends to very minute or small parts of the process, such as cutting, sewing, embroidery, printing, trimmings, packaging. All this is often done in completely separate factories or workshops. And to the point that modern fashion brands nowadays, they do not own any factory anymore themselves. So we see a whole big global sourcing network, and you can imagine, particularly as the entry barriers in the apparel production market are very low, a small factory will not be able to extract a large part of the overall value. And the other dimension really is a horizontal one, because the market, the sourcing network historically has spread. There's been a lot of geographical dispersion of that subcontracting chain and the competition that comes with it. So in modern times, let's say particularly from the 1960s onwards, we've seen a big shift towards offshoring, where South and Southeast Asian countries, also Latin American, Caribbean countries, have become major players. And that process was then, if you like, turbocharged further through the abolition of a quota system that was in place until 2005. So that has created a global sourcing networks where brands can switch orders from factory in one country to another very quickly, from one day to the next, if they want to. What's important in that is that to remember really is that brands run the show in these production networks. They control the access to the market, the consumer, and they set all the parameters in the chain. So even if they don't own any company in the chain, they set the rules of the game. So what styles, how many seasons, how fast do you have to produce, at what quality, and at what price. So there's a lot of asymmetry, a huge power asymmetry in the chain that makes it very hard for factories to negotiate a higher margin, or for workers to negotiate living wages or decent working conditions. And often it's not just about economic exploitation, but that also takes all forms of, at the shop floor, at the factory floor, can take all forms of psychological, physical, sexual harassment and abuse. I think a good way of illustrating that power in the chain, I think you have prepared a graphic, is that Zara hoodie that was researched by Public Eye, which is a Swiss investigative outlet. And you can see that, in a sense, essentially what it does is it shows how much each step in the production process accounts for the overall price of that hoodie. And you can see that the processes at the bottom of the chain can only extract a very small amount of the overall value. And if we take the textile factory, which is where the actual making of the garment happens, and which is also a very labor-intensive part of the production process, we see that the whole making of the garment accounts for 1/3 of Zara's profits, and that again demonstrates the power asymmetry in the chain. Probably I mean, probably one thing to mention here, just to wrap this up, is obviously what brands will say is that the global market is extremely competitive, which it is. But again, the power relations are also very asymmetric. So you could also turn this argument around and say, well, if we give workers in the textile factories a 10% pay rise, that would come to 0.153 euros of the overall price, which as consumers, we wouldn't even notice really. So in a sense, that argument can cut both ways, I think. I mean, there's a new dynamic. If you want me to explain a bit of how this has translated into the fast fashion.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, this is a really good illustration, but yeah, if you could say a little bit about what that's actually meant for what fast fashion has done, I guess, to supply chains. Thank you.
I mean, in a sense, fast fashion has intensified and sped up the production process. Probably there was a time at one point that few of us will remember where a season was kind of related to the weather. I've heard I think it was the H&M CEO a few years back who said that very proudly that they now change the whole range every week. So that created 55 seasons, which is massive enterprise logistically for the supply chain, but obviously I know it can also be quite mind-blowing for consumers, I would think.
Yeah.
Now, what are the repercussions of this for the supply chain and the workers? A good way to illustrate fast fashion is by looking at online brands. So if we take a physical shop that orders a particular style, it will need that style in a number of different colors, in different sizes, times the number of physical shops that they have, which results in huge order numbers. An online brand essentially only has one shop, which is the internet portal. So what they do then is they only place orders that are very, very small, let's say 500 units or 1,000 units max. And that allows them to track the orders, the sales in real time. And if a style sells, they can place another order, another small order, and so on and on and on. But for the factory, it means that they compete for orders, not just, let's say, once a week, but every day, Monday and afternoon. And that sort of builds in a downward pressure in the supply chain on prices. And obviously, we do know that that pressure is passed on to workers at the end of the day. So there's a direct link between how the market is organized, the market dynamics, what brands do, to the actual conditions in the factories.
That's really useful to help us understand and put those pieces together of how we've got to where we are right now. Thank you, Nick. I'd like to turn to our second speaker, Emily Fenves, sustainable fashion advocate and influencer. Emily created an initiative called Landerline in September 2021 after becoming burnt out with her own consumption habits. She embarked on a journey to learn more about the why behind her own overconsumption and decided to help others do the same. So as she's going to be with us sharing her personal research, she's also been doing that with her audience and partnering with ethical brands, change makers, and nonprofits. So through her initiative Landerline, she brings insight and hope to those who are inspired to reduce their carbon footprint through their personal consumption. And of course, this ties into labor exploitation. So Emily, could you tell us a bit about some of the discoveries that you made regarding fast fashion and consumption, and why you decided to take a different approach?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to see people from everywhere here. This community of slow fashion is global, and so it's going to take all of us to kind of shift some of the consumer behaviors that we've learned and unlearn some of the things that we've been taught. So my background is actually in social work. I'm a medical social worker. I have been for 10 years, very not related to fashion, but I've always been a lover of fashion and clothes and brands ever since I could remember. And it's been a big part of my life and how I show my creativity and express myself. When I became a mom, my style kind of shifted, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to express myself. And a lot of what I was consuming was fast fashion, not knowing kind of the exploitive things that are happening behind the scenes that brands don't want us to know. You know, they spend lots of money to kind of hide a lot of what's going on in their factories globally. So it's by design that we don't know a lot of this stuff. So I also, one of the things that I really talk about on my platform is taking the shame out of consumption, because I think consumers often get blamed for the problems that are going on in the garment industry, when really it's kind of like the lack of legislation, the lack of regulation, the brands itself promoting overconsumption and overproducing. So I never want anyone to feel bad for their shopping habits. We just kind of have to learn what the ramifications are of our choices and make different ones. So I kind of just got exhausted. I was on this cycle of shopping, returning, being kind of unsatisfied with the quality that I was buying. Similar to what Nick said it beautifully, kind of the process of making things as cheap as possible. That comes out in the quality of your clothes. So I remember I was driving home one day and I just said, I need to stop what I'm doing. Like, this is exhausting. It's taking way too much of my time. I'm always browsing online. I'm always receiving packages. I'm always making returns. Like, this is exhausting. And I really decided to commit myself and my time to researching kind of the psychology of shopping. And within that, I stumbled quickly upon kind of the horrors of the fashion industry and what's been going on for decades and decades and decades of exploitation. And so I became really dedicated to that research. I decided to share as much as I can with my audience, and have found such a great community of advocates who have strong voices. And there are organizations all over the world who are fighting for fair wages for people who are being exploited. And, you know, it is modern day slavery. There's wage theft, there's malnutrition, there's forced labor. So I think as consumers, you know, once we learn these things, there's several different action items that we can take. And so that's what my message is really about. And again, I think this can be such a heavy topic for people, and a lot of people don't necessarily want to hear kind of the bad stuff that's going on. And so I try and approach it in a very in a way that we can like kind of come together and create change without shame involved for maybe our past behaviors or our current behaviors. Because I think that if there's not going to be any action or any positive outcome if we're just shamed into some of these decisions and information that we're learning.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I think that's really it's great to get that personal experience especially from the side of the consumer. Now we're going to switch to the other side and take a couple of minutes to share a video from a very inspirational young lady named Nazreen Sheikh. Nazreen was born and grew up in Nepal, where she worked in the garment factory. She's since been able to survive her experience of forced labor and is now an advocate for change in industry practice.
So a little story around my sweatshop experience is I think I was around 9 or 10 year old when I was forced to work in a sweatshop, which means like a 10 by 10 room with 6 people. We ate, we slept, we worked in that 10 by 10 room, and we produced like hundreds of garments, and I was making same clothes and same stitch over and over and over and thousands of times, and I felt like a machine, and I was fed like animal and worked like machine, that type of energy. And like imagine being 10-year-old and just working non-stop 12 to 15 hours a day, and you're being forced by the manager to complete the mountain of garments that they would put in front of you, and you have to finish it, and only that's only then you will receive less than $2, and if you fail to finish you receive nothing. So for that reason we had to keep working, and sometime I had nobody to talk to, so I would talk to the shirt and to the clothes that I was making, and I would say like, whoever is going to wear these clothes, I hope they can feel me, I hope they can feel my bloods and my tears. So I tell people like, if you don't know where your clothes come from, we might be consuming suffering. So it is very, very important to know what we consume, what we wear, what we eat, what type of chocolate we are eating, what type of coffee that we drink, what type of clothes that we wear. That has a ripple effect on the like underserved communities. Like we might not see that, but it has a ripple effect, and because of that disconnection when I faced and when I realized in my life, I felt like I need to do something, and I think I was around 15 or 16. That's when I didn't even had a document, and I went to this, someone and knocked their door and says like, I need to have some loan, can you give me a loan? And the people.
Thank you. We just stopped it there because we wanted to show you the particular part of Nazrin's experience working in a sweatshop. And I think what's particularly interesting in hearing her personal experience is the way she describes the endless nature of the work, very repetitive, and the quantities. And I think that's really interesting, Emily, when you're talking about your own experience of just consumption. And I think what we're seeing now in trying to drive that consumption is influencers playing a really active role. And instead of thinking about adverts like we might have thought of in the past to drive us to consume, now it's about influencers promoting on social media, promoting the hauls that they have bought and trying on clothes, and do they keep or do they send it back, as you say, all the time it takes to repackage and send it back. Could you give us a little bit more of a idea for those who perhaps not so familiar about what this influencer landscape looks like, how it controls so much of our overconsumption?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I like to say that we're all influencers. When we're walking around in our daily life, someone might say, oh my goodness, where did you get that? And you tell them and they may or may not buy it. But influencing as we know it today is completely different than it was even like 5 years ago. When social media began, it was really a place for people to connect and build community and find friends and people that they have in common and speak with family from distances. And now it's impossible to be on social media and not be influenced. Brands know that that's where eyeballs are, right? And so they invest lots and lots of revenue on social media. So the interesting thing that I've learned about influencers is there's an element of exploitation there as well. Obviously not to the degree that we see and that we're talking about today, but we have lots of people, a lot of which are young women, who want to grow an audience as an influencer. And so they are spending their time promoting brands, talking about brands, selling things, and they're not getting paid by these brands. And the brands know that they are going to be able to get free content and free eyeballs for people who just want to have an audience and build that. Unless you have an exorbitant amount of following, you're really not going to be making much money the market is just it's saturated. And so you do have people who are spending money on their own clothes, promoting it and not getting paid. But yeah, I mean, influencers, there's no incentive not to, if you're making money as an influencer, there's no incentive to not do it anymore, to quit, because they are reaching their goals, they're making money, it's affecting their life positively in a way. The problem is how once an influencer or someone who's selling things online, fast fashion, finds out about some of the things that we're talking about, what's the role, what's the next step? And so the question is whose responsibility is it to kind of change the trajectory of social media and how fast fashion and influencers contribute to it? Is it the social media platforms? Is it brands? Is it the influencers themselves? I think that the word influencing is a tricky word too. I don't consider myself an influencer in that I'm not driving my audience to buy anything. My goal is really to kind of push back on that agenda and have people not buy anything. So we all, like I said, we all have influence. And I think the way we think of influencers today, it's very, very related to overconsumption and selling as much as possible. And as a social media user, that can be extremely frustrating because we don't always want to log in and, be reminded to buy the next thing. So it's very nuanced and tricky. But I do think influencers, especially the large ones who have huge followings, need to have, an understanding about kind of the repercussions of what they're doing and what they're asking their followers to do as well.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. We are going to turn to our third speaker. I'm really delighted that we have with us Rushan Abbas, who started her activism work way back when she was a student, organising and leading pro-democracy demonstrations at Xinjiang University in 1985 and 1988. Right now, Rushan's very well known for her activism and her work with the Campaign for Uyghurs, which she founded in 2017 to advocate and promote human rights and democratic freedoms for Uyghurs, and also to mobilize the international community to act to stop the human rights atrocity in East Turkestan. Now, I think Emily's questions and conversations are very interesting about the role of who it is that should be active in changing practices that happen now. And thank you, Emily, for your contribution on that. Now, before I turn to Rushan, I want to get a sense from all of you who are participating as to your understanding of the experience and the your knowledge of the Uyghur people, so that we know how much information to share with you. So you'll see in front of you, those of you who are joining this live, a poll. Please complete the poll, which asks you some questions about the Uyghur people and what's happening, so that we can make sure that give Rushan the opportunity to explain what she needs to explain to make sure that we're all following along in the conversation. I'll just give you a little bit longer. I can see that about half of you have participated. So I'll just give you a little bit longer to answer the questions if you have an idea of who the Uyghurs are, what's going on in China, whether you actually yourself stay updated with recent developments, whether you're aware of legal action that's taken by countries against Uyghur genocide and exploitation, or whether indeed you might actually consider yourself pretty much an expert. I think nearly everybody's answered the poll, and I can see already that it looks like the majority of people have about a third nearly have an idea of what's going on in China, but we do have about a quarter of our participants who have no idea of what is of who the Uyghur people are. So I'm going to turn now to Rushan, and based on this, ask you to give us some information on the Uyghurs and what's happening right now before we go into understanding the role of consumerism. Thank you, Rushan.
Thank you, Joanna. At first, I want to comment on that video message you played for us. And when I listened to Ms. Sheikh's testimony, it just broke my heart, because what she's talking is exactly the same way the millions of Uyghur people are subject to and taken to those kind of forced labor facilities as modern slaves. But the only difference is, she was a young girl, young teenager. But for us, those are our thought leaders, famous writers, professors, graduate students, successful business people. They are taken from their home and their neighborhoods and the jobs and professional positions, and sent to factories to work as slaves. So I thank Freedom United to organize this important event and giving us, the Uyghurs, a voice here. So what we are witnessing today in my homeland is Turkestan, known as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and under the rule of the Chinese Communist regime, is nothing short of an active genocide. And the Chinese government is making this a profitable venture, making this genocide with the slave labor, forced labor. And the genocide has been confirmed by around a dozen governments and parliaments around the world. So when we look at it, individual freedom to choose what we believe, how we believe, and why we believe is one of the major achievements of humanity. This foundation of liberty and freedom of conscience is under attack by the Chinese regime, while they are making the Uyghur culture and the religion is illegal, and they have been outlawed. Everything about the Uyghurs have been outlawed and punishable by prison and brutality. So the Uyghur people in the region live under the constant surveillance, if they are like ordinary people outside of the camps. But millions of people are in the concentration camps and the forced labor facilities and the sentence for long-term prisons just for practicing normal ways of religion or for being Uyghur. And basically the Uyghur people are given the ultimatum of you become Han Chinese, we allow you to survive. If you are going to be an ethnic Uyghur, then you disappear. Even the Chinese government propaganda news outlet, the Global Times Network, reported that 1.1 million Uyghur, 1.1 million Han Chinese cadres moved into Uyghur homes, and they're sleeping with the Uyghur families while they are monitoring and supervising the Uyghur people's daily lives. Basically, the Uyghur people are not even safe inside of their homes, and they are being slaves to serve those masters. And the Uyghur children are ripped from their parents' arms, sent to state-run orphanages or for indoctrination. As I mentioned, our thought leaders, academies, elites, philanthropists, successful business people, who are the keepers of the Uyghur language, culture, and the history and traditions, are being targeted and disappeared. Uyghur women's bodies are the true battleground for this genocide, with forced sterilizations, forced abortions, forced marriages, physical and sexual torture, and government-sponsored mass rape of the name of sham marriages, which government is sponsoring Han Chinese people to come and marry Uyghur women. If she refuses such a forced marriage, then they are being targeted as radicalized Muslims didn't want to marry non-Muslim Han Chinese. And despite the UN office report stating that China's atrocities may constitute crimes against humanity, and the acknowledgement of the genocide by so many different countries, but more than 80 global companies continue to profit from the Uyghur slaves. Your coat, your favorite, sneakers, Zara bags, car, even any kind of produce that if it's made in China, they may have been made with the blood, sweat, and the tears of my people, as so many different global brands use Uyghur slaves for their supply chains, and the world is being misled. And the Chinese government is masking these crimes as poverty alleviation and re-education to counter terrorism. And I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience, because I exercise my free speech in the United States as an American citizen. My own sister, a retired medical doctor, was taken hostage by the Chinese government. Just want to show you her picture. This is her. In September 2018, right after I did my first public speech, participating on a panel at one of the think tanks, she was taken. And now she's serving 20 years in prison. And the prison that she's being held at is connected with one of the apparel company. Basically, every time when I see something made in China, I wonder if that has my sister's forced labor, or the shirt on your back you are wearing today could be made with my sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas. So the Uyghur genocide serves as a warning for the future that we face, endangering our fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, free expression, and the international liberal order. Our family members are taken as hostage to silence us. The most of the global, the world leaders and the CEO of the companies, famous celebrities in Hollywood, everyone is voiceless, basically. When they are speaking about any kind of social injustice in the world, they don't speak about the Uyghur genocide or the Uyghur forced labor because of the benefits they are getting from the Chinese government. Basically, the Chinese government is using the trade and the financial benefits. They are undermining the universal human rights, and making everyone, not just the enablers of this genocide, while they are using the goods manufactured by Uyghur slaves and forced labor, but making every one of us complicit as well when we not to speak. So inaction is not an option. The stakes are too high, and it's beyond the tragic fate of the Uyghur people anymore. Now it's about the future of the free world, and if the world that we live for our children as humanity is once again being tested. And I want to conclude my remarks by reading a quote from a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and international human rights lawyer, David Matas. Quote, "Unless today's victims are defended, we run the risk of becoming tomorrow's victims," unquote. So I ask each of you to consider your part and how you can be the solution while you shop, while you deal with the Chinese government or any goods made with China. Thank you.
Sean, thank you so much. Yeah, it's as Trinity has said in the comments, I'm so sorry and heartbroken for you. It is, yeah, it's hard to put ourselves in your situation and understand the experience of being in a situation where you don't have that information of what's going on, and knowing that your sister's just one of many people who are going through this experience. And I think actually this is a great time for us to kind of combine a lot of the questions are about what we should be doing, and you pose that question, how important it is that we do act, that if we don't act, then we are ourselves complicit, and we want to talk about solutions. So we're going to start talking about solutions and combine our questions. And some of the questions are specifically on that topic. So I would first like to ask Cheryl to ask her question about the role of the US. So Cheryl, I think we should be able to give you permission to speak, and then you could ask your question, and then we'll hear a little bit more. Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, let's see. Let me keep this on point. So yeah, I often think of the complicity of the US government in the enslavement of folks around the world, serving this endless greed for control of more and more resources. And it just feels like all this is so plainly clear to see, like it's in plain sight. And yet, like a lot of this information that I get from these attending these, it's newish, but I'm also aware of it because I read a lot. So I really want, please, can you address how can we really create a storm of protest to get the US to change its policy? I know it begins with us, but yeah, I'm just really interested in how do we get them to even just acknowledge it publicly. Thank you. I'm done speaking. It may have been a little bit incoherent, but I'm just very passionate about this, and I really appreciate this. Thank you.
I appreciate you asking your question, Cheryl. Thank you very much. So yeah, is the US acknowledging this, and what actions are they doing, as well as another part of what you asked? Emily, I see you have your hand up, so I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I also want to hear from the other speakers too, because I think they'll have a lot of good information as well. But there are two pieces of legislation that are currently, one has already passed and one is still being worked on. But the first one is the California Garment Workers Act, which, you know, California has a large garment industry, and a lot of industry people that I've spoken with who have seen the factories in Los Angeles say that they're some of the worst factories globally, which is actually kind of surprising because we've always considered some of the global south to have, you know, really poor infrastructure and factory conditions, but it's happening in Los Angeles as well. So this passed and was enacted in 2022, which you can read about. I have some resources that I think we're going to send out. Remake Our World is a really great organization in the United States, and if you're interested in getting involved, I would highly recommend checking out their website because they have a lot of information on how to become active in the community. But the Garment Workers Protection Act, it's now law in California that any person working in the garment industry has to be paid a minimum wage that is not less than the California minimum wage. So I think right now, I don't know for sure, in 2021, the California minimum wage was $15 an hour. It had been documented that some garment workers were making $3 an hour. So now that this is passed, you know, brands are going to be fined if they are not adhering to the new law. And then there's another act called the Fabric Act in New York. I think it's New York. Don't quote me on that. That is also, it hasn't passed yet, but there's a lot of different specifications about how brands have to disclose their supply chain, as well as worker safety and things like that. So that's what's currently happening in the United States. It's definitely not enough, but it is creating momentum for conversations, which is kind of like the first step.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I think yeah, there are things for sure happening, but I think also, Ruslan, perhaps I could call on you to say what the US is doing about the situation you described as well, because I think absolutely we need legislation for workers everywhere, and certainly the US is not exempt. And as Callie has mentioned in the chat, the UK the same. But what about this really dire genocide that we're seeing in China?
Yes, we do need the legislations, but even when we do have the legislation, it's important to push for the implementations. We do have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that we worked really hard to pass, and it started to implement from June last year. But there are some loopholes that still many companies are using to ship to United States. And we do have another addition to that, another legislation that we need to help with everyone in the United States to push and get this passed, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act. As you mentioned, when the Uyghurs are being subject to this by the millions. We are not talking about some selective incidents here and there, but state-sponsored forced labor that the Chinese government is doing, the clothes and the electronics and toys and the other consumer goods that we purchase. Every one of them, when they are made in China, it is being subject to the Uyghur forced labor. So, and the companies will ultimately cater to the consumer and citizens' details. Sometimes we see that, like, for example, Nike was using the Black Lives Matter movement in order to drive up sales in the United States, while they are complicit with the Uyghur slave labor. They are continuously having the Uyghurs working for their supply chains. And so it is extremely important. While we are dealing with the companies, we do need the consumers, the shopping behavior. We do need people to be aware of not just because it is not on our principles and against any country's rules and regulations to import the goods made with slave labor. At the same time, it's hurting every country's and the company's business in the long term, because how do you compete with the free labor? How do you compete with slavery? So it's going to be actually detrimental for the local companies as well. So on our website, you can find resources, campaignforuyghurs.org, on the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition to follow the latest campaign and efforts. There's a part, a tab, Take Action, and under that they have a forced labor. So we need to always remember what is the consequences of the goods that we are purchasing when it's made in China. And there are two campaigns by the Freedom United, and I would like you to support them, but there's two that I want to concentrate. One is Shane. You see a lot of cheap goods all over being advertised, actually, from YouTube to TikTok and on the TV and everywhere. And they are actually using the loophole of the diminishes the loophole that we have in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and the shipping millions and the billions of dollar goods to all over the world, including United States, and also the solar panel industry. The clean energy is not clean when the solar panels are made with slavery, with slave labor. Uyghur forced labor is being used by the solar panel, solar industry. So the Freedom United has those campaigns, and they have the links to share those campaigns. Yeah, just wanted to say one more thing, when certain tons of human hair and collected by Uyghur people, human hair, when that passes all the customs and tariffs and makes it over to the United States Customs and Border Patrol, how many lives certain tons of human hair represents? When that made it to United States, we did not see the world screaming about that. We did not see it's being covered by mainstream media. We did not see the celebrities and the influencers tweeting or posting and talking about this. So we all have our parts. And if we don't speak out now, when it affects our own community, our own country, then the only voice left to speak will be one of regret. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Roshan. And I think this question of our role as consumers is really key for us, obviously here participating. And I want to turn to Nick to see if from an economic point of view, whether you say there's anything that we could do to change the market system and what we're seeing now. We actually had a question that came in via email ahead of this event from Cindy, and she asked, do we do any good for these workers by not buying these like sales items, Black Friday sales items, which I think really speaks to this sort of overconsumption question. Is there any way, Nick, that a solution looks like the role that we play? I mean, what would you say a solution could be, or how we can change the system?
Interesting question. Excuse me, but a tricky one as well, I think. I guess historically, consumer boycotts have sometimes had an impact where they were very focused and there was a very clear sort of political message and a clear target. And here you're almost talking to the whole industry, which makes it more difficult, really. I think that the goal is to take these fundamental human and labor rights out of competition. We don't want to have inverted commas bad companies undercutting the ones that try to do it sort of above board, if you like. Now the interesting thing is that wonder whether that's a paradox, but certainly worth thinking about is that in most countries, workers do have the rights that we are talking about on paper. All these countries have signed up to relevant United Nations or other conventions. It's just that there's a long path from an agreement about fundamental rights to workers actually being able to access and claim those rights. And I think, of course, there's a range of tools, sort of legal regulations. Emily has mentioned a few important acts. There are others. There's a lot of human rights due diligence legislation that has come from countries, a range of countries actually, as well as the European Union. But I think it's also important to see that often the political and economic interests overlap, which make it a lot more difficult to get there. So if we look at, I mean, Roshan has spoken about China, which is a very crass case, I think. We have a situation in Bangladesh where a lot of the members of parliament are actually also owners of factories. So, and obviously you can ask, where do workers have a voice in that system? And I think that's sort of an important thing, whether we can create a number of instruments, but at the same time, I think it's important to enable workers to use those instruments and speak for themselves, rather than us sort of being proxies, if you like. So I think that's important to build that capacity.
Sure. Yes, I think I can agree with you on that, definitely. And you've kind of touched on a question that Jason had about transparency. And he was asking, couldn't we solve all these issues with transparency? And Jason, I'm going to see if we can ask you to unmute and ask your question yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I was, I mean, I actually work in the industry, I work in the tech industry, and we use these sort of solutions for lots of other things. And it seems to me like if you had transparency, real transparency across all data points all the way through and had direct access to frontline workers, then all intermediate, all third-party certification problems, all of that stuff would disappear because you would be dealing directly with the people and having them vote through a DAO system or agree that they're actually being treated well. So, I mean, if you put all that, it's in the ledger, no one can argue about it. And all of this stuff in between becomes redundant because you're actually dealing with the real people rather than middlemen making deals, maximizing profits, minimizing costs, and those minimization of costs running downhill and affecting the poorest people in the supply chain.
Thanks, Jason. So I think there's kind of two aspects to that. One is about the ability to see right down the supply chain, like can we get that transparency? And then the second is this technological idea that Jason's proposed of using blockchain. If a speaker would like to contribute to either of those topics, please do chime in. Roshan.
Not so much for Jason's comment, but I was just reading the comments here on the chat, and I see Cheryl wrote, yes, to workers having a platform to speak for themselves. I want to say something. A country like China, no one has the freedom to speak. And I'm talking about me living in the United States since 1989. And when I spoke in the United States, my sister in China is in jail for 20 years. So none of these people will be able to speak freely while their parents, their siblings, their loved ones are hostage on Chinese government's hands. So if there's auditing systems, I hear a lot of companies or countries saying, oh, we are doing independent audit with the workers. And they said that they came freely with their free will and that they are there working and they're getting paid. No, those are all like pressured by the Chinese government to repeat what the CCP want them to say. So the platforms for workers to speak or any kind of investigation or auditing systems for the Uyghur forced labor in China will not work. So basically, today, when there's active genocide is happening, is the same as between 1932 till 45, when Nazi Germany was conducting a genocide against the Jewish people, having Holocaust, and the companies and the countries continue to do business as usual with Nazi Germany because of the economic benefits. Also, they knew what was happening. Then later, they all tried to claim the ignorance and the said information flow was too slow and they didn't know what was happening. Also, they knew. But today, the ignorance is not going to work. The people know what's happening. There are plenty of documents and research reports, and also the Chinese government's own leaked data time after time. The United Nations Human Rights Council's report, the commissioner's report stating the forced labor, labor transfer, all that. So today, continue to do business with China, continue to have factories, continue to have the labor and the people in China work for their supply chains, is being an active supporter and the enablers of this genocide. So as the consumers, as the individuals, let's do our part and do not be the part of this genocide as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshan. And I think the case is so strong in this case, in the Uyghur region, and also in supply chain systems that rely on Uyghur forced labor throughout China. And I think it's absolutely unconscionable, as you say, to source from a supply chain which you cannot guarantee is not using Uyghur forced labor, there's no excuse, as Roshan very clearly put. And I think in general, in the rest of the world, it's often not as clear cut. Supply chains are very fractured. The question that Jason asked is actually quite tricky, because even companies themselves don't often know the full I say history, but the chain of activity that a product or good has traveled through before it's reached their retail store. And not all companies are doing the due diligence they need to do to find out what's happening through their supply chain, who are all the workers that are involved in producing their goods. So as such, of course, it makes it difficult for us to find out. Of course, it is possible if you have the will there as a company, you can make sure you do know what's happening in your supply chain, and you can, of course, map your supply chain and the sourcing locations to risk where there is a recorded risk of modern slavery. We have a map called on map.freedomunited.org, which sets out a global picture of some of the products that are produced with a high risk of modern slavery. And of course, you can use blockchain to track those supply chain journeys. So it is possible, but there's a lot of work to do to uncover what's going on. And absolutely, we agree that companies should be responsible for doing that due diligence and ensuring that workers throughout the supply chain are in decent work. So great contributions, and I can see some brilliant conversations in the chat. We didn't get to all the questions, and we have in fact reached the full hour. I think it's really great to know how much passion and interest there is in this topic. We will be sending a recording around so that we can share the video to get more people to think about the goods that they buy, how much they're buying, and also what they're expecting of companies, and being clear about what isn't reasonable and the kind of change we want to see. So I first would like to thank great speakers for such different perspectives to make for such an interesting conversation. Roshan Abbas, Nick Hammer, and Emily Felvers, thank you so much. Thank you also to everybody who joined and participated in the conversation in the chat, those who submitted questions in advance as well. Please do make sure that you have signed up on Freedom United. You can sign a petition, and then you'll receive our weekly news digest. We'll also send out a recording of the webinar. So I am very grateful to everyone's participation, to our speakers, and I wish you all a good rest of your day or evening. Please do follow us, and if you want to use social media to report on this and share the link, you can also tag us at Freedom United HQ. Thank you very much.
Joanna, do you want us to stay on?